The story of money begins not with wealth, not with kings, not with gold, but with trust. In the earliest cities of Mesopotamia, where civilization first learned to gather, trade, and govern itself, the idea of currency emerged as a revolutionary invention. People began using clay tokens, small silver pieces, and eventually coins to represent value, to simplify trade, and to promise that one could exchange these symbols for goods, services, or labor. This was the first time humans had created a shared language of wealth, a system that allowed complex societies to function and flourish. But as soon as money existed, humanity also discovered a hard, enduring truth. Money can fail. It can lose value. It can collapse entirely. And the first recorded crash of currency teaches a lesson that would echo across millennia. It began quietly, almost imperceptibly, in a city-state that was ambitious, thriving, and yet vulnerable. Rulers wanted armies, temples, palaces, and trade networks that stretched farther than anyone had imagined. They wanted to demonstrate power, stability, and divine favor. And to achieve this, they needed resources: grain, labor, silver, bronze, and stone. The city's treasury was insufficient. There was only one solution available at the time: mint more currency. Silver tokens, clay tokens, and coins were multiplied. At first, this action seemed harmless. Traders did not immediately notice a difference. Prices remained largely stable. Soldiers and workers were paid on time. Construction continued. The city appeared prosperous, ambitious, unstoppable. But beneath the surface, the cracks were forming. Every additional token diluted the value of all existing tokens. Every new coin represented not wealth, but a promise backed by nothing more than faith in the rulers and the city itself. The first whispers of concern came in the markets. Grain that had once cost a handful of tokens now demanded a few more. Livestock and pottery rose slightly in price. Merchants and farmers began murmuring about inflation, about tokens that bought less than they once had. But the rulers dismissed these concerns. To them, the city was strong. The army was growing. Temples were being built. How could money possibly fail when the empire seemed so powerful? The tipping point arrived slowly. The city's rulers, seeking to fund ever larger projects and to maintain the loyalty of soldiers, continued to increase the number of tokens in circulation. At first, the extra coins were absorbed, but soon the supply far outstripped the economy's ability to back them. The value of each coin declined subtly, then perceptibly. Citizens noticed that their savings, once a store of security, were losing purchasing power. Merchants raised prices multiple times a day, anticipating the devaluation. Farmers refused to sell grain for the increasingly worthless tokens. Panic, though quiet at first, began to spread through the population. As the currency weakened, people adapted in ways that amplified the problem. Workers demanded payment in goods, not tokens. Markets became volatile as prices adjusted multiple times daily. Citizens rushed to spend their money before it lost more value, accelerating inflation. The very behavior of the population fed the collapse, just as it does in every financial crisis in history. The rulers attempted to intervene, passing laws to punish hoarders and speculators, imposing price controls, even recalling and reissuing currency. Yet every measure failed. The underlying problem was not mismanagement of trade, but the mathematics of money itself: too much currency chasing too few goods. Once trust in the currency breaks, no law can restore it. In this first recorded crash, families were hit hardest. Savings evaporated. People who had worked their entire lives to accumulate tokens saw them become meaningless almost overnight. Merchants struggled to maintain their businesses, unable to predict costs or set stable prices. Soldiers' pay lost value, leading to unrest and a growing sense of insecurity. Temples and public works suffered from delays and unfinished projects. The city, once thriving, was gripped by anxiety, confusion, and fear. And at the heart of this economic turmoil lay a truth that would be understood only in hindsight. Money is not wealth. Money is trust. And when trust dies, currency dies with it. Even at this early stage of civilization, humans recognized the consequences. Some citizens turned to alternative forms of exchange. Barter became common again. Grain, livestock, tools, and other tangible assets replaced tokens in daily transactions. People sought anything of intrinsic value, anything that could serve as a reliable store of wealth. The rulers, meanwhile, attempted to stabilize the currency through propaganda, reassurances, and the promise of reform. They told citizens that the tokens retained their value, that faith in the system would be rewarded. But the people had already seen the collapse unfold firsthand. Words could not restore what had been lost. The first currency crash had shattered confidence irreparably. Trade networks suffered. Merchants became wary of extending credit. Contracts were renegotiated constantly. Transactions that once took hours now consumed entire days, as every exchange required additional verification and trust building. Economic efficiency collapsed. The very mechanisms that had allowed cities to flourish, trade, labor, and investment, slowed to a crawl. And in the midst of this chaos, the city's rulers faced impossible decisions. They could continue printing tokens, trying to prop up the economy, but each additional coin weakened the system further. They could impose harsh controls, but enforcement was impossible. They could attempt to raise taxes, but the population had no trust left to contribute. The currency was dying, and nothing could save it. Historians looking back on this event see it as a turning point, the first clear example of a universal pattern. Financial collapse is not caused by chance or misfortune. It is caused by human behavior, compounded by decisions made in pursuit of power, expansion, and control. The first currency crash was a warning, a lesson that would resonate through every empire that followed. Rome, centuries later, experienced similar issues with coin debasement. France, during the Revolution, would struggle with the assignats. Germany, in the 1920s, would witness hyperinflation. Zimbabwe, Venezuela, and countless others would repeat the pattern. And the lesson remained the same. Money is only as strong as the trust behind it, and once trust is lost, the collapse is inevitable. Citizens adapted. They sought stability wherever they could find it, whether in goods, foreign currency, or precious metals. And in doing so, they demonstrated a timeless truth. Economic survival is rooted not in abstract promises, but in tangible value. The rulers learned their lesson too, although it took generations for the understanding to be codified into governance, banking, and law. The city eventually recovered, but the first currency crash left scars, economic, social, and psychological. It marked humanity's earliest encounter with one of the most profound truths about civilization. Wealth without trust is meaningless, and currency without stability is a disaster waiting to happen. And so, the story of the first currency crash ever recorded is not just a tale of money. It is a story of people, ambition, failure, adaptation, and the fragility of trust. It reminds us that even in the earliest days of civilization, human societies faced the same challenges they face today. Balancing ambition with responsibility, expansion with discipline, and the creation of wealth with the preservation of trust. The first crash was a warning, and its lessons echo through time, proving that every currency, every empire, and every civilization is ultimately bound by the same invisible law. Trust is the foundation of money, and when it breaks, everything else begins to crumble. As the crisis deepened, something remarkable unfolded across the city. People who had once relied on simple transactions began developing complex strategies for survival. Barter networks grew into informal economic systems. Families that once exchanged tokens for grain now traded tools, pottery, and livestock directly. This shift did more than undermine the currency. It signaled a cultural transformation. Trust moved away from the government's minted tokens and toward personal relationships, community bonds, and tangible goods. In this transition, people rediscovered what earlier generations had relied upon. Value comes from what can be held, used, eaten, or traded, not from symbols whose worth depends on promises. Merchants who adapted quickly survived. They set up new systems of negotiation, often relying on weights of barley or silver measured by hand rather than the official coins stamped by the city's ruler. The black market economy expanded quietly but efficiently. Even though the authorities tried to suppress it, the population depended on it too heavily. The official markets, once vibrant, crowded, and noisy, became eerily quiet. The marketplace, once filled with the sounds of bargaining and conversation, now felt heavy with distrust. Coins clinked uselessly. Traders looked at them with a mixture of suspicion and frustration. The city had entered a shadow period, a time when the old system had died, but no new official system had yet replaced it. The ruling class, desperate to retain control, responded in ways that, to a modern audience, feel familiar. They issued declarations praising the strength of the currency. They punished anyone who refused to accept the tokens. They demanded that taxes still be paid in the depreciating coins, even though no one wanted them. They held public ceremonies demonstrating their confidence in the money. But every time they forced the public to use increasingly worthless tokens, they widened the gap between the government and the people. The rulers insisted that the currency collapse was merely a temporary inconvenience, perhaps the result of merchants hoarding grain or traders sabotaging prices. They claimed the real economy was healthy and only needed time to stabilize. But time was the one thing the currency did not have. The deeper issue, the massive oversupply of tokens, could not be reversed. Even if the government stopped minting new coins, the damage had already spread through the entire structure of the economy. Trust was broken, and broken trust rarely returns quickly. Citizens did not care what the government said. They cared about what they saw. And what they saw was simple. Their money was dying. What once bought a month of food now bought only a week, then a day, then nothing at all. Price rises became absurd. A sack of grain that once cost 10 tokens now cost 100, then 500, then thousands. Workers demanded their pay in whatever the employer could offer: grain, tools, or even labor services. The city began to fracture socially. The wealthy protected themselves by converting their assets into silver, land, or foreign goods. The middle class, craftsmen, traders, small merchants, were devastated the most. Their savings vanished. Their monthly earnings could no longer cover even the basics. The poor, who already lived close to the edge, now faced hunger daily. Charity institutions tried to keep up with the growing need, but they themselves were struggling. Grain reserves were depleted. Donations lost value as soon as they were given. The crisis deepened as money, the lifeblood of the city, turned into dust. Even religious institutions, which had once stood apart from economic turmoil, felt the effects. Temples had long collected offerings in the city's currency, and these offerings funded public rituals, temple maintenance, and support for the needy. But now those offerings were nearly worthless. Priests found themselves unable to carry out sacred obligations. Rituals were scaled back. Repairs were postponed. Daily temple operations slowed. People interpreted these changes through the lens of spirituality. Perhaps the gods were angry. Perhaps the currency collapse was a punishment for arrogance, greed, or mismanagement. This spiritual explanation, while rooted in belief rather than economics, gave meaning to the chaos. It helped citizens cope with something that felt incomprehensible: the total breakdown of a system they had trusted for generations. Meanwhile, in the background, political tensions rose. Advisors blamed one another. Military leaders complained that troops were losing faith. Scribes documented everything, knowing that history was unfolding in front of them, even if they couldn't fully understand the long-term implications. The ruler, once confident and admired, now appeared anxious. Council meetings grew longer, filled with arguments and panic. The treasury, once a symbol of stability, was now a reminder of failure. Amid this turmoil, ordinary citizens became more innovative out of necessity. Some families returned to farming even within the city's outskirts, growing small crops to survive. Others engaged in craftsmanship, producing tools or household items they could trade. A new underground economy formed, one where trust between individuals mattered far more than the tokens issued by the government. Small networks of credit emerged, but only between people who knew each other personally. If a farmer trusted a potter, they exchanged goods now and settled accounts later. If they didn't trust each other, the deal didn't happen. This showed that while the official economic system had collapsed, human cooperation had not. People were rebuilding their own version of an economy, piece by piece. But the collapse of the currency also had geopolitical consequences. Neighboring city-states, seeing the turmoil, began to hesitate when trading or forming alliances. Trade caravans rerouted themselves to avoid the collapsing city. Foreign merchants insisted on being paid only in precious metals or goods, never in tokens. This isolation amplified the city's internal struggles. Without external trade, raw materials became expensive. Scarcity worsened. Essential imports dwindled. The city, once a regional hub of commerce and influence, now found itself increasingly cut off. The ruling elite faced a devastating truth. Their entire model of governance depended on the functioning of their currency. The collapse was not merely a financial issue, it was a political and existential crisis. They attempted reform after reform. One idea was to introduce a new type of token, built on a different standard. Another was to force a conversion of old tokens to new ones at a fixed rate. They tried confiscating wealth, redistributing goods, even employing the army to enforce economic directives. But every effort failed because they did not address the root cause. A currency built on trust cannot be restored by force. Eventually, the ruling class realized they had no choice but to accept reality. The old currency was dead. It could not be revived. The only path forward was to create an entirely new system, one backed not by empty promises, but by tangible assets. So they gathered the wisest advisors, the most respected merchants, and the most skillful scribes. Together, they crafted a plan: the introduction of a new currency backed by grain reserves stored in the state granaries. These granaries had long served as the city's emergency food supply, a symbol of stability during droughts and famines. By tying the value of the currency to something real, something measurable, they hoped to restore confidence. The announcement of the new currency was met with skepticism. Citizens had been burned before. They wondered why things would be different this time. The government promised strict controls on the amount issued, transparency in grain storage, and penalties for corruption. Slowly, cautiously, citizens began to accept the new system, not because they trusted the government, but because the new currency could be redeemed for grain, a commodity with undeniable value. The early days were rocky. Some people still preferred bartering. Others hoarded the new tokens, afraid the city would repeat its old mistakes. But little by little, the system began to function. Merchants started accepting the new tokens. Farmers agreed to exchange goods at stable prices. The underground economy slowly merged back into the official one. Grain stores became the foundation of the currency, and as long as those stores remained full and protected, people believed the money would remain valuable. It took years, not months, for stability to return. The scars of the first currency crash were deep and enduring. Families remembered losing everything. Merchants recalled the chaos of fluctuating prices. Priests remembered struggling to maintain sacred rituals. The government remembered how fragile its power had become. The crash became a generational memory. Stories told to children as warnings, recorded on clay tablets as lessons, engraved in the collective consciousness of the city. But it also left the world with a legacy. The first currency collapse taught humanity a timeless truth. Money must be based on trust and discipline. If those two elements break, collapse is inevitable. The city learned to use money more responsibly, to monitor supplies, to avoid reckless expansion. And long after the rulers, merchants, and citizens were gone, historians would look back and recognize this event as the first documented failure of a monetary system, a moment that shaped the future of economics, governance, and civilization itself. Yet the story does not end there. The collapse also taught future societies something deeper about human nature. When institutions fail, people innovate. When money dies, people adapt. When trust breaks, communities rebuild trust in smaller, personal ways. The fall of this early currency did not destroy the civilization, though it came close. Instead, it forced evolution. It pushed the city to rethink wealth, value, and responsibility. Over centuries, the story of this collapse became a reference point. Empires that followed repeated the same mistakes, despite the ancient warning. They printed too much currency. They assumed that strength, land, and armies guaranteed financial stability. They believed they could manipulate value without consequences. But the collapse proved otherwise. Money obeys laws deeper than politics. It is bound by trust, scarcity, and perception. Ignore these principles, and collapse will return. The first crash was a mirror held up to humanity. It revealed ambition, fear, creativity, and resilience. It showed that while leaders may fail, people endure. And it demonstrated that every generation must relearn the lessons of those who came before. The tokens may have crumbled, but the memory of their failure survived. In that memory lay the wisdom that future civilizations used to build more stable and disciplined economies. In the end, the story of the first currency crash ever recorded is not just a tale of economic disaster. It is a story of rebirth, a reminder that even when the systems we rely upon collapse, humanity finds a way forward. And while the coins of that ancient city have long since turned to dust, the lesson remains as sharp and relevant today as it was thousands of years ago. Money is fragile, trust is priceless, and the cost of forgetting history is always paid in collapse.